Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to City of Asylum. My name is Alexis Jabor. I'm the senior production manager here. We're very pleased to welcome you for this afternoon's reading in partnership with the International Poetry Forum, the second of these that we've hosted. A quick backstory, you just heard from Hafsa, who is a resident in the International Cities of Refuge Network. This is a network of around 80 cities all over the world that take in artists who have had to leave their homes because they have been persecuted specifically for their artwork. We started housing artists in 2004, now I have to say 21 years ago. And we, over the years of doing this, we started with just one author, a Chinese poet named Hua Zhang, and over the years have grown to host multiple authors at the same time, and have also grown to have this cultural center where we have bookstore, although you're seating in it right now, performance venue, and restaurant where we host over 120 programs a year, free and open to the public. And so it is very fitting that very first writer we had, he was a poet, and poetry programming holds a special place in our hearts. And so it is just a wonderful joy to have the International Poetry Forum back and working with us. And I have a very special announcement that we told some of you before the program that we were not able to receive the book in time. And in fact, it has just arrived as that video was playing. So the book is here, you can buy it. Kimiko will be happy to sign it after the program. And if you've already ordered it, I'm pretty sure we can swap that, give you the physical book, but I'll double check that with our bookseller. And so to get the rest of this program started, first I would like to welcome Jake Greffenstedt of the International Poetry Forum.
Good afternoon and welcome back to the International Poetry Forum. My name is Jake Greffenstedt. I am the new director of this recently revived organization. Many of you know the International Poetry Forum was founded in Pittsburgh in 1966. It went on hiatus in 2009 and just relaunched with a reading by Terrence Hayes here in the fall. So we are so happy to be back in action after 15 years, especially today to have one of my favorite poets with us. I'm going to bring up a wonderful, another poet, Lee Horikoshi Rorapa, who's going to introduce our speaker. But first, I wanted to say a note of thank you to City of Asylum for being a wonderful host venue, and to our two co-presenters today, the Carlow University MFA and Creative Writing Program, and the Carlow University Mad Women and the Attic writing workshops. And I wanted to recognize the director of the MFA program, Tess Berry, who wanted to say she's been absolutely wonderful. And Tess, who assures us she does not need a microphone, just wanted to say a quick note from her seat. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Lee Horikoshi Rorapa. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here at the storied City of Asylum. It is such an honor for me to welcome Kimiko Hahn to the International Poetry Forum. Jake has kindly asked me to open today's event by reading my poem, Dream Carp. This poem is inspired by a traditional Japanese story and reflects upon the relationship of the artist to their art. Dream Carp. People traveled from miles away to see my paintings of fish. The jeweled armor of their scales, the bead-like set of their eyes in rubbery socket rings, the glimmering swish of fin and tail, so real it seemed that you could almost dip a net deep into the paper and pull up the arching wet weight of a golden carp, a shiny trout, or the dark muscular heft of a bass with its mouth stretched into the surprised wiry O of a child's windsock. I captured my models from the sea, lake, and goldfish pond in the back garden, so careful not to let their mouths be torn by the hook, their scales chipped, or the silky tissue of their tails ripped by a clumsy hand. I kept them in large glass bowls, fed them mosquito wings or dry silkworm pupas offered from chopsticks. And when I was finished making sketches, I quickly took them back and set them free again. Every night, I dream I swim with these fish as a golden carp, black spots on cloisonne scales, pulled to the surface by the deceptive, creamy luster of the moon or the sizzle of firefly lights across the water. And every night, I am tempted once again by the smell of the baited hook, by my predictable hunger for earthly things, and each time I am surprised again by the stinging hook in my lip that pulls me mercilessly into the bright air, setting my gills on fire, the sharp silver pain of the knife that slits me open so easily from tail to throat to reveal the scarlet elastic of my raw gills, the translucent film of my air sac, the milky rise of my stomach, and the gray marbled coil of my intestines. I rise late each day and work in brighter light. When I die, I will have my paintings brought down to the lake and slipped into the water. First, the edges of ink will blur, and then there will be a great flurry as the fins, tails, and bodies begin blossoming into life again, each fish detaching from its canvas of silk or rice paper, a swirl of color, motion, swimming away.
Lovely.
Thank you. And now to our featured poet, who's a poet that I hold in such high esteem. Kimiko Hahn is the author of 10 collections of poetry, including The Ghost Forest, New and Selected Poems from W.W. Norton, 2024, which plays with given forms while creating new ones, and in doing so honors past writers. Previous books, Toxic Flora and Brain Fever, were prompted by the fields of science. The Narrow Road to the Interior takes its title and forms from Bashō's famous journals. Reflecting her interest in Japanese poetics, her essay on the zuihitsu was published in the American Poetry Review. In 2023, Kimiko was named a chancellor for the Academy of American Poets and received the Poetry Foundation's Ruth Lilly Lifetime Achievement Award. Additional honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship, Penn Volker Award, Shelley Memorial Prize, Theodore Rutke Memorial Poetry Prize, American Book Award, and National Endowment for the Arts Fellowships. In her service to the field, she enjoys promoting chapbooks and has created a chapbook archive at the Queens College Library. Hahn is a distinguished professor in the MFA program in creative writing and literary translation at Queens College, the City University of New York. Please join me in welcoming Kimiko Hahn.
So, good afternoon, and thank you to the International Poetry Forum for inviting me to this extraordinary relaunch of their legendary series. I am very honored, and in particular, thanks to the new director, Jake Griffenstadt. Hope I pronounced your name correctly. Okay. For his suggestion to turn my attention to Matsuo Bashō. Also, thank you to the co-sponsors who you've heard about already, Carlos University's MFA program and Mad Women in the Attic writing workshops, and of course to the City of Asylum. I was here a number of years ago, and I'm so happy and honored to be on this stage again. So I'm calling my little talk and reading here, Narrow Road to the Zuihitsu. And I will open with an excerpt from one of my pieces in my Narrow Road to the Interior. Sparrow. Bashō wrote, and Sam Hamill translated, "The moon and sun are eternal travelers, even the years wander on." I always wonder about translations, but can never recall enough Japanese to measure a text for myself. So many semesters of bungo, and what I recall most is the plodding pace of those semesters in the wood-paneled libraries. Now I rely on translators, and I have collected 5 versions. Actually, now it's 10 versions of. With small children, the days pass achingly slow as one pulling her earlobe refuses to nap, the other refuses to sit still unless cartoons anesthetize, but the years speed past. Suddenly it's true. The 3-year-old is 13, taller than the mother, and recalling the word no in numerous forms. Why should I? I'm going to anyway. Yeah, right. Even retaining no mommy. Now, with children in this sublet, Saturdays through Tuesdays, I find time has changed. A lover on opposite nights, and the sorrow of flight as I continue to leave my husband. Also, the relief, not only of leaving our matched flaws, but from flight itself. Who is the traveler but the heart, or, depending on the moment, the gut? A flock, startled by a child's outburst, rises as a single lake of wings. Of the 5 versions I've collected, one is entitled "The Narrow Road to the Interior." The dog slinks off my youngest daughter's bed when I enter her room to kiss her goodnight. It's our ritual. The dog hops up at her invitation, slinks off when I open the door, then, when I leave, I hear her quiet flop back on the bed. Flight also includes sleep, as this child lies on her back, snores, then rolls over onto her side. Where is she? Only she knows, and might not recall the journey upon waking. Where was the adult before rising too late? Then to legs on my lover's shoulders. At this moment, it is painful to leave and more painful to stay. Any residue of affection has twisted into an anger keen as a scalpel, brilliant as a blade, clean as glass. I wish to hold my husband, hold our separating. The body would like to recall the humidity even or especially in February, even as the dog would too early reddens, then freezes the next week, but is still not ruined. What of the nestled pupa, more uncompromising than we imagine? The brown branches, the pink moments, I was at a loss. Was marriage my imagination? I look at photos of cheery tanned profiles from little family vacations and cannot know what I was thinking. As after my mother's death, I walk around seeing objects from a haunted world, a child's Easter dress, box of 4 crystal glasses, unopened package of men's t-shirts, a beach towel. The delightful ones pin me to sorrow, that bird. By way of introducing Matsuo Bashō's famous Oku no Hosomichi, I will start with the title, which has been translated variously. In fact, there are at least a dozen translations in English alone. The variation mostly rests on the word oku, meaning deep or inner, and refers to the remote inland areas of northern Japan. Here are 7 of the titles. The Narrow Road to Oku, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, The Narrow Road to the North, the narrow road through the provinces, the narrow road to a far province, the narrow road to the interior, narrow roads of the deep north, back roads to far towns. I am partial to the narrow road to the interior. The word interior covers the geographical meaning and, for me, the sense of a pilgrimage away from the city into rugged regions. There is also the meaning that one travels inward to one's own interior. Such wordplay is an essential element of Japanese poetics. For example, looking at haiku's 17 syllables, wordplay starts with a concrete image that gives way to more. The reader can move from a linear, literal meaning to a spatial experience, whether psychological, spiritual, and so on. A common example is the Japanese word matsu, which means wait and pine, as in pine tree. To use pine, matsu, in a Japanese poem will call up an image of, say, waiting for one's lover, but also pining. English also offers a double meaning for the word pine. So if one is sitting under a pine tree, one may be sitting under longing, that is, in a state of pining. The form, the zuihitsu form, and the form of the narrow road to the interior, Bashō's, has inspired writers in and outside Japan for decades. Oku no Hosomichi has been described variously, and for me, the most useful is a poetic diary. Why? Because a diary in Japanese literature is not a diary in the Western sense of recording or documenting. In fact, Bashō spent 5 years revising the prose and poetry to create the truer journey. We know this from his different drafts and from comparing it with his poet-monk companion, Sora. And the word poetic in poetic diary covers both the literal inclusion of poetry and also implies taking poetic license, right? Again, not being wedded to fact. Oku no Hosomichi is what we in the West would consider creative nonfiction and/or a hybrid text, both trending terms but nothing new. Here is an excerpt from Bashō. Not far from the temple, in a mountain hermitage near Ungan Temple, my Dharma master, Bashō, wrote this haiku. A 5-foot thatched hut. I wouldn't even put it up, but for falling rain. He inscribed the poem on a rock with charcoal, he told me long ago. Curious, several young people joined in, walking sticks pointed toward Ungan Temple. We were so caught up in talking, we arrived at the temple unexpectedly. Through the long valley, under dense cedar and pine with dripping moss, below a cold spring sky, through the viewing gardens, we crossed a bridge and entered the temple gate. I searched out back for Bashō's hermitage and found it up the hill, near a cave on a rocky ridge, like the cave where Myozenji lived for 15 years, like Zen master Hon's retreat. Even woodpeckers leave it alone, hermitage, in a summer grove. One small poem, written quickly, pinned to a post. All the Bashō I'm reading, by the way, is translated by Sam Hamill, which I believe is the copy that is being sold here too. A word on Matsuo Bashō. He is, as you know, well known for his haiku, which was then called hoku, and also for his renga, which is a kind of collaborative activity. In Japan, it's often known as linked verse. His dates are 1644 to 1694. For reference, Samuel Pepys' famous diary was written from 1660 to 1669, so right kind of in between Bashō's life. At age 30, actually I'll read a little bit more. The Matsuo family was of samurai descent, and Bashō probably served General Todo Yoshitada in a capacity similar to a page or servant. The elder composed poetry, and with him Bashō engaged in that world. After Yoshitada's sudden death, Bashō left, and it is unclear what he did during this period, except for continuing to write poetry. He was quickly recognized for his simple and natural style. By age 30, he was inducted into the inner circle of the haikai profession. Imagine that one could have a profession like that. In this, he was able to study with master haiku writers. By his mid-30s, he had full-time teaching 20 disciples. Several personal downturns led him to begin traveling, which at the time could be quite dangerous. He returned to Edo and later left on other travels. Of his many diaries, Oku no Hosomichi is considered his masterpiece. He traveled for over 150 days and covered nearly 1,500 miles, mostly on foot. The scholar Nobuyuki Yuasa wrote that the text is, quote, Bashō's study in eternity, and insofar as he has succeeded in this attempt, it is also a monument he has set up against the flow of time, end quote. One of Bashō's aims was to walk on the same roads as the earlier poet Saigyo traversed, and here in this next excerpt we have a glimpse. At Ashino, the willow Saigyo praised, quote, beside the clear stream, still grows along a path and in fields of rice. A local official had offered to lead the way, and I had often wondered whether and where it remained. And now today, the same willow. And here is Bashō's poem. Rice planting done, they depart, before I emerge from willow shade. I must confess that for decades, I was not personally attracted to haiku, which I was reading in translation. There was something flat about the ones that I was reading. Also, I didn't care, personally, for the customary progression of observation, enlightenment. And in my opinion, American versions were closer to senryu, S-E-N-R-Y-U, which is a comic haiku without the requisite seasonal reference or pivot. Some writers seem to think that a haiku was anything with 17 syllables. I actually favored the 31-syllable tanka and the classic poets I read in college. But though I was influenced by Japanese poetics, I hadn't written in any Japanese forms during those early years. Then, in 1991, New York Poetry Project Director Ed Friedman invited me to participate in a millennium celebration of the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. I learned from him later that the Pillow Book was actually a kind of cult classic among the beat poets. For the event, I wrote The Downpour, where I attempted to channel Sei Shonagon's cheeky tone. It is not in The Narrow Road. It's in a book called Mosquito and Ant. And I'll read two brief excerpts. We do not know her name. We call her Sei Shonagon. Shonagon for her own palace title, minor counselor. Sei, a character from her father's clan name, Kiyowara. We do not know her name, but she is not anonymous. Recent research suggests her given name may have been Nagiko, but we do not know her name, just as we do not know the name of her contemporary and literary rival, Murasaki Shikibu. We do not know her name, though it seems she was married to Tachibana Norimitsu and may have had a son. On the other hand, neither may be true. I love to hear a man talking while making love. Not too much, of course. I love to hear what he'd like to do or to have done. However, the atmosphere is flattened if the man has phlegm in his throat, and instead of gently coughing, he gurgles on. Or if the man says he's going to come soon, and really does. How boring. You should read Sei Shonagon if you like that. I've written, or more correctly, explored the zuihitsu genre ever since. And I purposely call it a genre. It is not a form. In Japan, it is a genre in and of itself, so it's not poetry or prose. And in 2006, I published a collection of my zuihitsu and tanka, The Narrow Road to the Interior. If I may be so immodest, the collection circulated the term zuihitsu outside the East Asian and Japanese studies departments, and for better or for worse, others have been trying their hand also at zuihitsu. Worse? I have been rethinking my own attempts, and I am now interested in a kind of course correct. I do think that my piece, Utica Station, holds up pretty well. It is a poetic journal, a fictionalized version of a trip I took to Rome, New York, and I doubt I could have written without having studied Japanese poetics. I will read the whole piece. It's in a slightly revised version in The Ghost Forest. Utica Station. Depart 10:07 a.m. to New York Penn Station. In the cavernous station, the train delayed for over an hour. I have watched a woman tend her newborn. She is tall, slender, and has light, dark skin and light eyes. Green? She ties her hair back. I cannot see the baby. The man who picked up the ticket and kissed them, very black, shaved head. I have watched her because her baby is so quiet, and I have not heard her voice. On the train, she sits one seat ahead and across the aisle. When the train breaks in Albany, the baby cries, "Ah!" and she replies, "Ah!" and I think, just what I would do. Then feel miserable. Was I ever so attentive? Placing one or the other child in the stroller, on the changing table, in a sassy seat, in the sandbox surrounded by plastic starfish and seahorses. Stay, come back. She cradles the child, a boy by the blue, her rocking syncopated with the train's chugging. Rain flecks the gray window. We pass a ditch of 100 tires. a muddy lot of containers, trees like sticks, a stray willow. We pass by the buds with such speed it could be late winter. My heart is swollen, large as a newborn. I do not want to return to their infancies. I would merely do the same, want to be in this notebook, not on the carpet covered with dolls, to be at the window waiting for their father, not swinging them in the park. That was my mother in the sandbox. The farther south, the greener. Is it my imagination or the proximity to the river? I see a couple on a tiny jetty holding a pink blanket. My heart is swollen, as if a gland, not a muscle. But I am wrong. There were stories I'd read and reread. Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel, the runaway bunny, Ping the duck. If I read a big word, I'd explain as if the explanation were part of the narrative, private, one's very own. Escape, get away. There were evenings where we ate picnic dinner on the Columbia lawns while their father worked late. I remember because when a plane roared over us, I'd say, "Plane, plane," and she would look up to watch it zoom away. One of my first tasks was to name things. Then it became her task, one daughter's, then the next. We'd walk from apartment to park. Pizza, doggy, fire truck, naming things. Daisy, train, bus, car. It is so difficult to travel with an infant, the bags of plastic things, one's own pockets weighted with keys and change, maybe a magazine stuck in somewhere, balancing a cup of coffee with one hand, steering the stroller with the other, the baby struggling to be held, difficult pleasures. Writing time, remote. I told myself then, I need to slow down, as if picking lice off a child's head, as if reading a poem, instead of sniffing around for the self on some median. Along this train ride down the Hudson, the tracks run so close to the water, it's as if the tracks were laid on pilings, or as if the water were the rails. I wonder if there is clay along the river's edge, just as Barbara and I found clay in the brook behind her house, or as my daughters dug into the sand for the red clay on Fire Island, our hands afterward cinnabar red. Always, Mommy needs to, I need to. I look up from the notebook and see a tiny island with the shell of a castle. What is that? Is that how I've been a mother? Dogwood blossoms, a cloud in the grove of branches, a sailboat, a rowboat. The mother and infant sleep now, the boy like a cat on her chest, or as if her heart rested across her sweater. I do recall that lovely pressure. As we near the GWB, George Washington Bridge, a tugboat towing a barge. Part of the bridge is wrapped in cloth, as if chilled. I wish we didn't need to plunge into a tunnel. Now Forsythia, now Weeping Cherry. I think of my mother, dead these past 7 years, 8 by Buddhist count. Come back. Through a brief tunnel, I can see the boy behind me reflected in the window. He's been kicking my seat as if sport. I need water to swallow an aspirin. I need to stretch. My heart is swollen as if a hot water bottle. The mother pats the baby's back. With the other hand, she begins to collect jackets for them. To put on an infant's jacket, I'd curl my hand through the small cuff and up the sleeve, then pull her arm through, a tiny trick. There was a difficult moment on a city bus when I finally got the baby to stop stamping on the seat by plunking her down. The passenger behind me leaned forward and said, "You're a good mother." I nearly wept. "Stay, come back." A mother with a fishing rod. Looking for sensation on some median, in some station, now speeding away from an acquaintance, I might have asked, "Shall I slip off my dress?" But I didn't. There is no longer that urgency. A mother with a plastic kite. This is the difference. I can't find myself trailing a man around a room, screening, gesture, and tone. This is the difference. I thought I was missing something, as if a party balloon. If my hair didn't get so crushed, I'd wear a baseball cap too. What would it say? Stay, come back, water, pee-pee, you. The sudden brick landscape of Harlem, just before the last tunnel, the dozen poles in the river, swollen and rotted from a long vanished pier. That's what my heart was, swollen, like a mother weeping for something, a pier missing. That was written so long ago. Now I have grandchildren at those ages. Here is another excerpt from Bashō. It's the final entry in Oku no Hosomichi. I should note that futami means both parting and is also the beach where the Isuzu River enters Ise Bay. So it makes sense when I read this. Also, hamaguri clams are considered a symbol of friendship because they have, the joined shells. So again, my giving these comments beforehand is to alert you to these, to the wordplay that we can't really hear necessarily without reading the original or knowing the Japanese. So here's Bashō, the final entry to the narrow road to the interior. A disciple, Rotsu, had come to Tsuruga to travel with me to Mino province. We rode horses into the castle town of Oogaki. Sora returned from Ise, joined by Etsujin, also riding a horse. We gathered at the home of Joko, a retired samurai. Lord Zensen, the Keiko men, and other friends arrived by day and night, all to welcome me, as though I'd come back from the dead. A wealth of affection. Still exhausted and weak from my long journey, on the 6th day of the darkest month, I felt moved to visit Ise Shrine, where a 21-year rededication ceremony was about to get underway. At the beach, in the boat, I wrote, "Clam ripped from its shell. I move on to Futami Bay. Passing autumn." A few moments ago, I admitted that I am interested in a kind of course correct, because when I was writing the zuihitsu that would end up in A Narrow Road to the Interior, I was really exploring the form for myself. I wasn't trying to write models, which in some instances they've become. So I'd like to, now with what I have learned decades later, I'm trying to write them more as zuihitsu and less as just kind of playing around and exploring, which was very important for me at the time. At the time, mine were kind of a mashup of both conventional classic zuihitsu and modernist collages, which I had studied in undergraduate studies. So lately, I've tried to turn back to earlier Japanese examples, especially from the Pillow Book of Seisho Nagon. And so I'll close with two of them that are in list formats. And this is in some book, I can't remember which book. Firsts, in no particular order. Purple towel on Grove, down comforter on South Davenport, deck in Lonelyville. Then, of course, that rug burn, Outer Borough. A Buddhist temple storage closet over the humid dojo. My mother in a pine coffin on a late morning in early March before they slid her body into the furnace for all time. Ruby Tuesday on the car radio before the cesarean. Louie Louie before the vaginal. Water, radicals. Grandpa's teeth in a glass and shame, shame for laughing. White moire taffeta, snow, Blondie. Pinky, air pocket. The Waldorf Astoria. Olivetti Lettera, 22. Dialectical historical materialism, lumpen proletariat, dictatorship of the proletariat, moribund capitalism. Levine's poem, Gin. Keep her cool, it's a febrile seizure, not uncommon. Chlorine. The lights opened on my powdered white face, tiny red lips and skeins of pink silk, a dance my daughters will dance. K-I-M. M-O-M. 800 quarters. My mother. Rowing with Daddy in the Catskills, even while it poured. Martini up with olives. Was it stirred? And this is a relatively new zuihitsu, also in a list format. Nouns that have a religious quality. Lacquer, wood, moss, rock, straw. Lacquer can be black or deep orange. A natsume, both a personal item and a high-ranking tea utensil for tea powder, was named after its resemblance to the jujube. I have a plastic one I purchased for classes in Niigata, 1972. Moss, either in a garden or under a forest tree. I love to discover a clump with British soldiers, although now that I look it up, I see the name is for a lichen. Further research, I find the moss Polytrichaceae. One site notes they have teeth, and one kind is known as bristly haircap. I might be wrong, considering there are over 12,000 species of moss, but I think I'm right. There are also moss imposters. Blood. Of course, there are common words, although they have little personal meaning anymore. Chalice, altar, liturgy. Also, cross, although the word can be noun, post with a traverse bar or a hybrid, verb and adjective. The most important object in our whole apartment is a stack of flat stones or a single plain stone around which I tie a tiny bib. R asked why I have such things, in several nooks, and I told him about Jizo, how she or he is the Buddhist patron saint of children, hence the bib. We stack stones to help the babies who do not make it to the afterlife and whose task it is to do so. More than blood, cerise, maroon, scarlet, vermilion. More than blood and more than incense, incensed. Thank you very much.
Kimiko, thank you so much for that beautiful reading. And just for context, what Kimiko did today was extraordinarily generous. Most poets are promoting their recent work, and this book that she primarily read from is so important. She's correct to say that it's really the book that's credited as bringing this genre into the English language. So thank you so much for revisiting this book with us. What was it like coming back to these poems after 2 decades?
Well, putting together my new and selected, looking and trying to figure out which selected poems to choose, I would get pretty melancholy sometimes. It was hard, I've been married 3 times, so there's a lot to go through. My lovely husband is very patient listening to these old poems. So it was melancholy. I also decided, and I write about this in The Ghost Forest, I didn't go to an MFA program. I had extraordinary teachers as an undergraduate, and there weren't as many MFA programs. So I didn't have the kind of attention or craft classes that, say, my students have. So I felt in putting together The Ghost Forest, I gave myself permission to slightly edit some of the poems from decades ago. And so I was mentoring my young self in a way, and that was a pleasure.
I know you were just so loved as an educator, and there are a number of poets in the audience that I know for a fact, several said that they have never experienced this genre before. So if you were going to give, say, an MFA student advice, they're looking to learn about the zuihitsu and then eventually work towards writing in the genre, where would you say they should begin?
I have had that question, and the answer I give is doesn't make people very happy, because it is to go read The Pillow Book of Seishonagon, Essays in Idleness by Kenko, and of course some of the travel diaries, especially The Narrow Road to the Interior. Because the zuihitsu is a genre that doesn't have a particular shape. It can look like a poem, it can look like a diary, it can look like an essay. It is not the kind of genre that you can describe the way you can describe, say, formal poetry or a short story even. So one really needs to immerse themselves in the Japanese classics. And fortunately, there are a lot of translations and interesting translations. And then to understand the different forms they come in, that they come in. So the ones I just read are in lists. They're a list format. And you may have noticed that sometimes you didn't know what the heck I was talking about. And that's because, in my mind anyway, a zuihitsu oftentimes has an organizing theme or subject. So if you look at the Pillow Book of Seishonagon, she has dozens of zuihitsu called Things That Remind Me Of, or Things That Should Be Elegant, Things That Are Unsuitable, Things a Lover Should Do or Not Do. So those kind of lists, and they're very erratic. They're not just like a list of, say, 10 things, right? They can really vary. And I could go on for a couple hours.
You were saying earlier that you're starting to experiment with a number of traditional forms now in the last few years. Have there been any other forms or genres that you've been most excited to experiment with?
Yes. So when I was growing up and writing poetry in the 60s, 70s, 80s, excuse me, I was a hippie, and it wasn't cool to write formal poetry. That was bourgeois, or at least among my set. So now, of course, decades later, I'm very interested in writing sestinas and pantoums and villanelles, and sometimes using them as rough drafts. So I have in the Ghost Forest, I have some sestinas that are identifiably a sestina, and some you can tell are really the ghost of a sestina. They're no longer actually follow every requirement, but there's that ghost of it behind that. So, and the sestina was the hardest for me to do. It took me a long, long time to write one that I thought was pretty good. I had to stop trying so much. I was telling Lee, yeah.
You've spoken in a number of your interviews about introducing students to writing in all sorts of different forms, and indeed just introducing your students to poetry. And this is a big part of our mission at the International Poetry Forum. We work with a lot of high school, college students, but then also people, we have a number of folks who have come through in the past who are in their 30s, 40s, and saying, I felt intimidated by poetry growing up. This is going to be something I finally want to take seriously. So I know you've spoken so beautifully about this before. When you speak with students who maybe come to poetry with that hesitancy, what's your strategy as an educator?
When people ask me for a word of advice in interviews and so forth, my stock answer is throw the map out. Because if you know what you're going to write ahead of time, one very often, not all the time, one very often begins to censor oneself as you're writing, because you're writing toward an idea. Writing prompts are different from writing assignments. If I say, write a poem or write an essay about your grandmother who came here from Maui, that assignment needs to be an essay about your grandmother who came from Maui, right? But if I say writing prompt, grandmother from Maui as your working title, start writing, it may end up being about sitting on a stage with a glass of water. It may have nothing to do, but it's what prompts. And I really believe in writing prompts to just kind of get you going and just begin to play. And Dorothea Brand wrote a book in the 1930s where she is called Becoming a Writer, and she had lessons on how to tap the unconscious, because that's where you want to get to.
That's wonderful. I want to turn to a few of your influences. We solicited questions from social media and emails, and I got a lot of questions about your major influences, which I think is a great compliment to you. It's something like if you're fascinated with the Beatles, you really want to dive in and figure out where those influences come from. So I think the fact that people are interested in your influences is a testament to your work. And start with someone who spent some of the first year of their life just down the road here, Gertrude Stein. Mm-hmm. I know is a great influence. Some of the questions that came in were on Gertrude Stein. You've spoken about Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and you mentioned the Beats. Maybe we'll start with when you were in college. You said that's really when you started to experience poetry in a big way for the first time. What were the books that really just opened your eyes to the world of poetry?
Well, actually, even before, when I was in high school, my parents loved Gertrude Stein. They were both visual artists. So they had collected a lot of Gertrude Stein books, which I've inherited. And so I was reading her in high school, kind of, flipping through and just jumping into her language and her idiosyncrasies and eccentricities and so forth. So I love the freedom she gave me from very early on as an emerging writer. Ferlinghetti 2, Coney Island of the Mind, I read in high school. When I got to college, I read, I had a class that was just on William Carlos Williams and Robert Frost, so they immediately became very important. But so did John Donne. He is so wacky, I was teaching an intro to literature class, and I taught The Flea, and I said to the students, next class, we're going to read one of the wackiest poems in the English language. And so that got them interested right away. And then afterwards, an accounting major came up to me and said, can I find more of his poems in the library? I was like, that's it. I'm good. I did a good job. So, I kind of all over the place as far as influences. Certainly a lot of Japanese writers in translation. Murasaki Shikibu, The Tale of Genji. And then in college, I was reading the work of my teachers. So Louise Glick, Charles Wright, Marvin Bell, Donald Justice, Michael Burkhardt. So I had extraordinary teachers as an undergraduate.
And I know, just as this event was sort of a celebration of your work and the work of Matsuo Bashō, you recently did an event similar to this on Emily Dickinson, who you describe as one of your great influences, especially recently. So what was your encounter with Emily Dickinson like?
Well, I had always been a little fearful, speaking of people who are jumping into poetry and not really, maybe being a little fearful of it or not entirely comfortable. Maybe not uncomfortable, but not entirely comfortable. So I loved Emily Dickinson, but for decades, but I didn't know what the heck was going on there, which is okay. I don't mind not knowing what's going on, but when you're teaching, you should know a little bit. So my husband, who is Americanist, Professor Emeritus, introduced me, we talked about Emily Dickinson, but he also introduced me to Helen Vendler's book, which is one of my desert island books, right? It's called Dickinson, Selected Poems and Commentaries. And in it, she takes 150 of the poems and does very close readings, which apparently in the past 20 years, young people haven't really learned how to do, which I don't understand. Anyway, it's a whole other topic. And the commentaries are about 2 to 5 pages. So during the pandemic, long story short, during the pandemic, I read one essay every day. So for 150 days, I read a poem and a commentary. And then, because I love writing prompts, I made up a writing prompt using the commentary, and I just scribbled. And I learned so much. And I feel I was apprenticing myself. That's probably giving myself a lot of credit, but I felt like I was apprenticing myself to Emily Dickinson's work via Helen Vendler's brilliance during the pandemic, and I learned so much.
If you had a year to dedicate to a similar project where you were going to do 150 close readings of poems by a single author, do you know which poet you'd choose?
Maybe John Donne. Yeah, because he is so what a mind. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. Yeah, Billy Collins was here a few months ago. He had said in an interview that his encounter with The Flea was his first experience of literary jealousy.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. You mentioned you've just had such great educators in your own life, and I know you love writing prompts. Is there a single writing prompt you remember from your education that was your all-time favorite?
Yeah. So in Louise Glick's class, and I guess I was a junior, she said, write a poem about a fear using a color. And I was recently introduced to the phrase oppositional defiance by my daughter. And so a little oppositional defiance to that Louise Glick assignment. And I thought, oh, I'm the daughter of artists. There's no color that I associate with a fear. And then a few weeks later, she gave us another assignment. She said, write a poem where the climax is in the beginning and the rest of the poem has to kind of balance out that climax. And those two writing prompts kind of percolated around in my brain together, and I wrote When You Leave, which is the last poem in The Ghost Forest and the first poem in my first book. So that was a wonderful. It wasn't so defiant after all.
We were talking about children and grandchildren, and actually, in several of our previous events, we've had questions about writing prompts specifically for young people. 2.5 is quite young, but I'm so happy you read your poem, Utica Station. That's, as a parent, as a son, that's one of those poems that just shakes the dust off the soul. And so I'm thinking of very young children being introduced to poetry. So do you have a favorite writing prompt to give to, say, a 7-year-old?
Wow. He's getting me on the spot here because he knows my granddaughter's 7. I think just playing with words with her. So this is like that, right? Just introduce how figurative language works, because they actually know better than we do. As your daughter said, right? The opposite of a diaper is a chair.
That was last week, yeah.
That's crazy. I love that. I want her to give me an assignment, seriously, that is extraordinary. So, but I think just playing with language, and even if it doesn't make any sense. When I was first born, actually, my parents moved to Italy for 2 years, which sadly I don't remember, but I heard Italian. And then also, when I was a little girl, my mother would sometimes read Japanese stories to me. I didn't understand a word that was going on, but all that listening to language, I just love. Even if I don't understand what's going on, which goes back to the Gertrude Stein and Emily Dickinson, right? Just kind of revel in the sound and texture of language. So, I can't remember what your question was, but anyway.
No, that's perfect. The International Poetry Forum, when it was founded in 1966, really took as its focus to host poets who take the public performance of their work seriously. And from the first year, that meant that the founder, Samuel Hazo, got actors and musicians involved. So Judy Collins, the folk singer, she was the first musician. We're hosting her again in the spring, which we're so excited about. But obviously, the oral component of poetry is something that shines through in this book, Narrow Road, and there are mentions of reading Tale of Genji out loud. And just in terms of you as the reader, say again with the grandchildren, is there a favorite text that you like to read out loud?
I like reading Japanese folk tales to them. They're in English, but I'll bring in some Japanese words now and again, and they get it and they remember it. So I love doing that. I just learned a couple weeks ago that the Japanese language has more onomatopoeic words than any other language. So in the story of the little peach boy, the old woman was she and her husband didn't have children. She's washing laundry in a river, and down the river comes this big peach. And come to find out, there's a boy in it. But the sound that a peach makes floating down the river is domburi kokko, sukoko. So my grandchildren love that. Domburi kokko, sukoko. So I like including words. Just gonna slip it in there now and then.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about your work. We were chatting before, your work with chapbooks. And I've realized actually that the object of a chapbook is something that's familiar to poets. But actually I've encountered many extremely literate people who have never heard of a chapbook. It's sort of a niche object. So I wonder if you could sort of, maybe for those in the audience who aren't familiar, talk about what a chapbook is, and then talk about your own work promoting chapbooks.
So a chapbook, strictly speaking, and there are any number of people who will argue with me about this, but strictly speaking, a chapbook is under 40 pages and does not have a spine. It can be Xeroxed, hand letter pressed, mimeographed actually in the old days, printed out on a computer. It seems like a very ephemeral object, although sometimes it's an object of art too. So it takes different forms, different appearances. A number of years ago, I was speaking with the other with the MFA directors of the 4 City University of New York MFA programs, and as we were getting up to leave, Lou Asikoff from Brooklyn College just casually mentioned that his graduate students were making chapbooks to give each other after the graduation ceremony, and at that time, I thought, really, this is I'd really thought of, and this is so stupid looking back, I thought of chapbooks as being very vanity press. You just did it for yourself, and you know, it just seemed vanity press like. But come to find out, and this is where I was mightily corrected, it's part of the gift culture more and more. And it's part of the DIY culture, do-it-yourself culture, more and more. And I love seeing people trading, swapping, selling them. So at the AWP conference, Association of Writing and Writing Programs conference, it's an annual conference, and they have a huge book fair. Once I got it knocked into my head that chapbooks are incredibly precious because you control the market. You're not at the whim of a publisher necessarily, or of a small press, right? You are working with a small press. I would go around the big book fair and I would buy chapbooks. And I'd ask them, are you taking unsolicited manuscripts? And they'd kind of look at me like, maybe. I said, would you take a look at one of mine? So I eventually, after a number of years, I got 10 of my own chapbooks published. So put your poetry where your mouth is, right? And it's really, I like thinking of it as this sort of outlaw area where young people, emerging writers, older people, such as myself, it's a really important place to circulate your work. I had so many of them in my office, aside from other books at school, that I asked the library if I could donate and make a chapbook archive. So Queens College has 200 chapbooks, and they'll be getting more. So, so I think I really promote chapbooks. I think they're really important.
Thank you. And this is a great note for anyone, any poets in the audience, or anyone who's never written a poem before. You know, I was extremely lucky. The English teacher I mentioned, the late John Manor, my English teacher growing up in Pittsburgh, actually brought chapbooks into the room. And it was this moment where he said, you know, you can go home and do this. You can get your printer paper and staple this together. And everyone kind of had this look of, you can do that? And so it's this, I highly encourage you, if you write poetry and maybe you don't consider yourself a professional poet, it's a wonderful way to really think about the craft of creating this object. And then you can go and look up online and see the incredible work that Kimiko has done and promoting this art form. But I wanted to ask you just one final question. Usually when you're asked for advice of young writers, you suggest that they read their poems aloud, which I think is just the best advice. And usually, you know, you encounter words and new ideas that you would not have encountered otherwise, where you're not reading it aloud. So in terms of the public presentation of poetry, do you have any all-time idols of poets who really take the presentation of the work seriously? And then when say poets here are looking to present their work in public, do you have any advice that you tend to give for the public recitation of poetry?
Well, a friend of mine who is no longer with us, Sekou Sundiata, he was a performer before the word before the phrase spoken word. He was doing just that, and oftentimes writing poetry impromptu, and just genius. He recorded his poetry, so I would have to say he's just extraordinary. I think taking your time, taking a deep breath, these are just little practical. I actually I just hang upside down for a minute. And apparently I've been told that really, you stop bunching up your shoulders, as I do, as one does. So you just kind of really relax for a moment before I read. I do that, and then try and take my time. Yeah, so just little practical bits of advice.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so glad you mentioned Sekou Sundiata. He is also an alumni of the International Poetry Forum, and I believe he returned to give an early performance at City of Asylum, maybe more than a decade ago. And that brings me to one point I want to conclude with. You know, it's been wonderful to work with Carlow University. The archives of the International Poetry Forum from 1966 to 2009 are housed there, and the audio archive is available online. It's one of the most, truly one of the most incredible collections of recorded poetry in the world. There's recordings by many of the great poets of the 20th century. You have Auden, Bishop, Brooks, Borges, and many of the great performers as well. So the recordings by James Earl Jones, Grace Kelly, Gregory Peck, all three of whom served as honorary board members of the International Poetry Forum. So if you're passionate about poetry as a performed art, would highly encourage you to consult that archive. And yeah, the last thing I want to do is just to thank you for being a part of this relaunch season. We're so happy to have you here. And if you would all join me in saying thank you one more time to Kimiko.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And the weather is terrible, and the Steelers lost last night. But I was speaking to our founder, Samuel Hazo, who is in tremendous health and is writing some of his best work at 96. And he really got teary-eyed when he heard that, you know, in such a short amount of time, 200 people signed up to make this a sold-out event. So thank you for coming out. We have this miraculous arrival of the books that are available for purchase and for signing. So Kimiko will be here to sign your books. And thank you once again for coming to this event by the International Poetry Forum. Thank you.